Well, if nothing else, it's nice to see Civil War reenactors getting a payday. I'm just kidding, no it isn't. This is a review of the Star Trek Voyager episode, The Q and the Gray. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. Having Q drop in the first time went so well that the producers of Voyager decided to invite him back. Makes sense. Its first Q episode, which I reviewed in the previous video in this series, was one of Voyager's best episodes ever, and the second highest rated episode of the season. Another Q episode probably wouldn't be as successful as that, but it couldn't be that much worse either, could it? Could it? Things start out well enough. The crew is excitedly watching as a star goes supernova. That's neat. Chakotay turns to Janeway like, "Okay, you've had enough science for one day, young lady. Time for bed." Janeway returns to her quarters where she's greeted by Q, who wants to show off his Hugh Hefner Halloween costume. Janeway isn't impressed, but Q's like, "Listen, let me just impregnate you real quick. You, a billions of years old being, want to have sex with me, a woman who is orders of magnitude younger than you? Yeah, what do you think? I think you're taking your Hugh Hefner cosplay a little too far." Q leaves, but returns the next day as Janeway is talking things over with Chakotay in the ready room. Q's like, "Oh, so there's another man, eh? That's why you didn't jump into bed last night so I could stick a baby in you. What's so great about this guy? The face tat? I can do a face tat too." Janeway's like, "That tat ain't all that," and walks out. Later, Tom Paris and Harry Kim are hanging out in the holodeck, and Q appears, hoping they can give him some advice for how to get in their captain's pants. Tom's like, "Have you tried flying with her in a shuttlecraft at warp 10 so you both turn into giant salamanders?" That's no help, so Q, no doubt depressed by his romantic misfortune, turns to drink. He orders some booze from Neelix at the holographic bar and says, "I'm tired of window shopping. How can I get that captain of yours to let me sample the merchandise?" And Neelix is like, "We don't serve leering perverts here." Except Mr. Berman, of course. Cut to Janeway's ready room once again, where Q tries to bribe her with a puppy and takes a softer approach, claiming that his previous attempts to seduce her were just his childish way of covering up his true feelings. The fact is, he's lonely, and he doesn't just want to have a baby with Janeway. He wants a relationship, a family, stability. Janeway's like, "Nah." Just then, a lady Q appears, and she's like, "Q, what are you doing with that dog? And I'm not talking about the puppy." It's kind of an old joke, isn't it? I'm 5 billion years old. I wrote that joke. Lady Q is Q's ex, you see. They just broke up, and apparently it was not amicable. But no time to worry about that. Janeway is called to the bridge because there are more supernovas. These are supposed to be incredibly rare events, but now they're popping off like weasels. Janeway suspects Q is responsible for the sudden flurry of supernova activity, and Q's like, I mean, perhaps in a way. 3 supernovas are up at the same time, and Voyager doesn't have time to avoid all 3 shockwaves, and the shields might not be able to withstand the impact. Janeway demands that Q do something, so Q snaps his fingers and transports himself and Janeway to a southern plantation house during the American Civil War. Seriously, you guys? You do a Jonathan Frakes cameo in the last Q episode and a Civil War gimmick in this one, but you couldn't do them both at once? Now if I make another North and South reference, it's going to seem like I'm reaching, and you know how I hate that. Q, dressed as a Union officer, explains to Janeway that this isn't actually the Civil War, it's the Q continuum. Q is causing Janeway to perceive the continuum in this way because it's a reference she's familiar with and it represents what is actually happening, a Q Civil War, sparked by the death of Quinn in the previous Q episode, Death Wish. Following the events of that episode, Q began speaking out more forcefully for independence and individuality, creating a conflict between himself and those who supported him and the forces of the status quo. That's why Q wants to have a child with Janeway, he explains, to combine the omnipotence of the Q with the compassion and morality of humanity, to create a new Messiah, to lead the Q into an age of benevolence and peace. Janeway's still like, nah. As part of this conflict, the Q have created weapons powerful enough to harm each other. The use of those weapons is what's causing the supernovas. So, that explains that. Musket fire smashes through the windows and Q is wounded. From outside, a leader of the opposing army demands Q surrender, but Q refuses and fires back with his pistol. More musket and artillery fire bombards the house, and Janeway drags Q out. Back on Voyager, they've survived the supernova shockwaves, but now Lady Q is stuck on the ship without her powers. It's something to do with the supernova and the Q Civil War or whatever. Chakotay guesses there must be another way to get to the Q continuum besides having a Q snap their fingers, and Lady Q is like, yeah, there might be. And she advises the crew on how to modify Voyager to take a trip to the continuum so they can rescue Captain Janeway, and she can, look at Q's phone to see who else he's been DMing. Janeway has brought Q to the relative safety of one of his army's camps. She observes that Q's side seems to be losing the war and suggests that, to end it, instead of conceiving a child with her, Q should conceive a child with Lady Q. But Q doesn't like that idea. He's like, no, Q never have sex with each other. The power dynamic is too even. Janeway's like, well, you'd better figure something out, because I'm walking over to the enemy camp and telling them you're ready to negotiate for peace. And that's exactly what Janeway does. She goes to the opposing camp, meets with their leader, identified in the IMDb credits as Colonel Q, so let's go with that. And she says, Q is ready to discuss a truce, so what do you say? And Colonel Q is like, I'll entertain a truce under one condition. You give me back my damn daughter. Actually, Colonel Q has a better idea than negotiating for how to end the war. Executing Q, who it just so happens his men have already captured. And since Janeway has been helping Q, she's gonna face the firing squad too. The next day, I guess, however time works in the Q continuum, Q and Janeway are lined up to be shot. Janeway pleads with Colonel Q to end the violence, and for all the Q to use their powers to be a positive force in the universe for once in their goddamn lives. Q asks that Janeway's life be spared, but Colonel Q is like, nah. Colonel Q gives the order to fire, and shots ring out. But what's this? The shots weren't being fired at Q and Janeway, who are unharmed, but at a band of Union soldiers who are attacking the camp. And among those Union soldiers are members of the Voyager crew. Chakotay, and Paris, and Tuvok, and Harry, and there's Lady Q as well. I guess they successfully entered the continuum and landed the ship in a fucking cornfield or something. And then the bridge officers told the other 150-odd people on the ship to just hang out for a bit while they left and talk the other Q into letting them join the army and use Q-killing weapons. It's all so straightforward, there's really no need to show any of it on screen. Paris magically teleports himself behind Colonel Q and forces him to surrender. Then Q and Lady Q announce that they have a way to end the war, and everyone ceases firing. It seems Q and Lady Q have decided to try Janeway's wacky let's just have sex with each other plan. So that's what they do. They have sex. Right there, in front of everyone. But all they do is touch fingertips, so no nudity or anything. Listen closely and you can hear the sound of Rick Berman indignantly throwing his script to the floor. Q sends Janeway and the others back to Voyager, and then pays Janeway one final visit in the ready room to introduce her to the baby. Aw, look at the baby. Q says, hey, do you want to be the godmother? And Janeway's like, I'd be honored. And then Q and his baby leave, and that's the end of this fucking terrible episode. There are few more extreme examples of creative whiplash possible in the Star Trek franchise than going straight from Voyager's first Q episode to Voyager's second Q episode. As I said in my review of that episode, Death Wish is one of the best shows Voyager ever produced. A bit of unnecessary fan service aside, it is outstanding in every way. The Q in the Gray is exactly the opposite, utterly abysmal from top to bottom, poorly conceived, pardon the pun, ineptly executed at every level. It's just bad. Let me start with the premise. Q wants to have a baby with Captain Janeway. Let's have a baby, it'll solve all our problems, is an unwise strategy in real life and in fiction. More specifically, in this case, it emphasizes Q's creepy, sexually predatory side, first glimpsed in his abusive attempts to control Vaj in the DS9 episode Q-less, and I think that's best avoided. All of that, making Q a sexually aggressive creep and evoking Q-less, but even beyond that, Q's desire to have a baby with Janeway makes no sense. It makes no sense in the larger context of Q's other Star Trek appearances, since we've seen in earlier episodes that members of the Q continuum have conceived children before, but regular viewers of mine know that I care less about long-term continuity, especially between series, than I do about the episode I'm watching right now, and Q's desire to have a baby with Janeway makes no sense in that context either. As Q eventually explains it, he wants to have a baby with Janeway to combine the power of the Q with the positive traits of humanity, conscience, compassion. He wants to create a messiah. He uses that word. And he seems completely convinced that this is a great idea and it's going to work. But he never explains how he thinks it's going to work, except in vague declarations about how their child will usher in a new era and Janeway will be the mother of peace. Why would the leader of one of the factions of the Civil War having a child with someone completely unrelated to the conflict resolve the conflict or have any effect on it whatsoever? Is Q blinded by his desire to end the war, or is he just that much of a dipshit? Moving past the shitty, nonsensical premise, the script here is just rotten. This episode has some of the flattest dialogue of the entire series. The cast, regulars and guest stars both, deserved bonuses for the extra work they had to put in to make some of these garbage lines come across as well as they do, and they do not come across well at all. Most of the dialogue consists of characters blandly describing what's happening at the moment or commenting on it in the most obvious and literal way possible. This episode was produced in 1996, so I know it couldn't possibly have been written by ChatGPT. It just sounds like it was. Functional, perfunctory, witless, and lifeless. Most disappointingly, Q's dialogue falls into this category as well. John Delancey and Susie Plaxon, who guest stars as Lady Q, try their best to wring some semblance of snark or personality or cleverness from their lines, but even actors with their considerable comic talents can only do so much. Delancey is given so little to work with that he resorts to clownish mugging much of the time, and Q mostly comes across as desperate and unpleasant. For her part, Plaxon finds a snide superior note and sticks with it. The result is a one-note performance, but given how the character is written, I'm not sure she could have done any better. The one I feel most sorry for, though, is Ethan Phillips as Neelix. Fortunately for him, he really only has 2 bits in the entire show, but they're both awful. One is when he has to react to the supernova in the first scene with, "Wow!" like a 4-year-old seeing fireworks for the first time. The other is his scene with Q on the holodeck, when he indignantly informs Q that Captain Janeway likes him, Neelix, because he is respectful, loyal, and most of all, sincere. Characters dryly and literally describing themselves to other characters. Truly the essence of drama. Phillips does his best, as does everyone else, but there's just nothing to work with. Even the director of this episode, Cliff Bole, who has directed some classic TNG episodes, Hollow Pursuits, Starship Mine, and oh yeah, The Best of Both Worlds, seems to be just going through the motions. The episode is filled with baffling, aggravating directorial choices, like in the scene where Q gives himself a bigger face tattoo than Chakotay's. Then Janeway and Chakotay walk out of the room, and Bole shoots Q from an angle where the face tattoo is barely even visible. Or this exchange between Q and Janeway in the plantation house, which is weirdly shot entirely in close-up, with Q and Janeway just standing there as though their feet have been nailed to the floor. Or this shot near the end, when Janeway says something to Harry, and Harry responds, But there's no shot of Harry. He's in the background and out of focus in this shot of Chakotay. That's it. Was there not time to shoot coverage of Harry saying this line? Or at least to rack focus to him when he says his line in this shot? Were they pressed for time with some of this stuff because they wanted to make sure they had enough time to do justice to the scenes in the Civil War encampments? If so, they shouldn't have bothered, because those scenes are the shits too. The idea of the Voyager crew joining the Q Union Army and rushing in to save the day in the nick of time is ridiculous and contrived, and the unimaginative staging of the battle scene doesn't help at all. Also, how exactly does Tom manage to sneak behind Colonel Q without the Colonel or any of his soldiers noticing? I get that they wanted to end the fighting and have the Voyager crew win on a definitive beat, but that definitive beat shouldn't leave people in the audience scratching their heads and asking how it could possibly have happened. And finally, Q's a daddy now. Like, literally, not daddy in the more idiomatic sense of a sexy, confident, mature man, like Ensign Mount is a daddy, or I'm a daddy. Like, daddy as in father. Q's a daddy. He's gone from the callously amoral imp who put humanity on trial for its existence and flung the Enterprise directly into the path of the Borg just to prove a point to Captain Picard, to a daddy with a cute little baby. Aww. Between their handling of Q and the Borg, I think it's safe to say that no one is better at defanging and sanitizing villains than the writers of Star Trek Voyager. If they were assigned to write a sequel to No Country for Old Men, it would be about Anton Chigurh buying a horse farm and adopting a trio of adorable orphans and learning the true meaning of love. If they wrote the series finale of Twin Peaks, Bob would decide to stop possessing people and stay in the Black Lodge from now on and start a new career writing cozy mysteries. If they wrote a Star Wars movie, it would end with Kylo Ren turning from the dark side and finding redemption by sacrificing himself to save the life of Rey. Wait, did they write a Star Wars movie? They're as bad as those fanfic writers on Tumblr who need to make everything wholesome. Actually, the Tumblr fanfic writers are usually more creative than what we see in the Q and the Gray, so never mind. Bad episode. Bad. Those are my thoughts on the Q and the Gray. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me again next week as this batch of Q episode reviews concludes. Next time, I'll be reviewing Q's third and final appearance on Star Trek Voyager in an episode titled Q2. See you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.